Shadow Jumper, chapters 19 through 21. The shrieking came from cages stacked on top of the metal counter that ran along the far wall of the laboratory. From where he stood, Jack could see dark shapes scurrying backwards and forwards, red eyes glinting in the torchlight. They edged closer, Beth keeping her fingers firmly in her ears. Jack peered into one of the cages. It housed two white rats, or rather, they must have once been white, looking at what remained of their fur, but each had pink patches of skin showing through, and several of those bare areas had developed red sores. He almost retched from the smell like rotting meat. The animals, so noisy when they first entered the room, had calmed down apart from the occasional squeak were quiet. Lab rats, they've been experimented on, said Jack, icy coldness enveloping his body. Do you notice anything strange about their sores? Like what? Beth came over to join him, her shocked expression mirroring his own. They're like the ones on the dog. But who would experiment on a pet? Rats and mice, yeah, I've read loads in my magazines about testing drugs on animals. But pets? Beth shook her head. I don't get it. And children. Who would experiment on children? The faint voice muttered inside Jack. Is this Blackstone's private lab? Said Beth, looking around. The one Fiona told us about? Guess so. Look at this, Beth called. She moved along to a workbench in the middle of the lab. The bench housed a mess of test tubes, jars of chemicals, and other pieces of equipment. Piles of books lay in a stack on the floor, and on one of the lab stools and a tower of cardboard file boxes teetered on the edge of the bench. A potion gurgled away in a container over a flame. Jack swallowed nervously, wiping a sleeve across his eyes. Soon, somebody would be coming back to finish their experiment. Beside all this stuff sat a mound of paperwork. Beth held a sheet of paper in her hand. It's a report, she said, moving nearer the lamp, about the rats. She went quiet, causing Jack to glance at her. His heart skipped a beat as he snatched the paper from her. The report contained a heap of scientific data, most of which he didn't understand, and it wasn't until he reached the final paragraph that he found some information he could make any sense of. He pointed it out to Beth, who read it aloud, running her finger underneath the words. The rats treated with anti-aging serum, without exception, have shown an adverse reaction to sunlight, resulting in sores, rashes, and hair loss. This new set of trials shows that no further progress has been made to eradicate these serious side effects. They're sensitive as sunlight, like me, Jack bit his lip. I've got exactly the same symptoms, apart from the thing with the hair. Of course, that's what he found so troubling about the dog on the side of the road. Its skin reminded him of his own. Jack gazed at Beth in disbelief. He realized he was trembling. What if those rumors in the newspaper were true? What if Dad experimented on children with this? It's called anti-aging serum. What if I was one of them? His legs started to buckle underneath him, and a spasm of pain shot down his injured leg. He needed to sit before he collapsed onto the floor. Beth seized his arm and propelled him towards a stool. It might be a coincidence. There are loads of causes of photosensitivity. Just because you've got an allergy to sunlight as well doesn't mean you were experimented on. There's no mention of children in the report, is there? None of this made Jack feel any better. A lump had developed in his throat. He thought he was going to burst into tears. It's all falling into place, he said. The rumors, the newspaper reports, Dad having to leave, the rats, my skin, everything. And it looks as though they're still doing the research, which means Blackstone must be in on it. Do you really believe your dad would hurt you? Beth shook her head in exasperation or something else. He didn't care what. His brain was too full to listen to what she was saying. Jack rubbed his hand over his eyes, angrily brushing at the tears that had welled up and threatened to fall. No, I don't know. We'd better go, said Beth in a quiet voice. I hate this place. Suddenly she froze. The rats had started their squealing again. Quick, I think someone's coming. They managed to duck behind the bench as somebody entered the lab. There was a click and a light came on. A stool scraped across the floor. I could do with a coffee, a man's voice said. Want one? There was a grunt and the door opened and closed again. The rustling of papers was swallowed by a loud yawn. Jack looked at Beth as they crouched behind the bench, hardly daring to breathe. The door creaked open again, followed by the sound of clinking mugs. It's time I dealt with these rats since there's no sign of improvement. We don't want to risk contamination of the healthy ones, the same man said, his voice coming from over by the cages. There was another scrape of the stool and the sound of footsteps moving in the same direction. Jack grabbed Beth's hand and, still half squatting, pulled her towards the door. He tugged it open, twisting round to glance behind him as he did so. The two men stood looking in the cages. It was the taller one who caught his attention, even though he had his back to Jack. Lanky, long legs, and a mop of unruly dark hair. Suddenly, all the blood seemed to rush from Jack's body. Dad? Both men spun around, their eyes opening wide as they clocked Jack and Beth. Chapter 20. In that split second, Jack realized his mistake. It looked like Dad from the back, but it wasn't him. The men's eyes registered first shock and then anger, so as Jack attempted to get his wobbly legs to work. He stumbled against the doorframe and almost collapsed in a heap before Beth jerked him out of the room. They shot along the corridor, making their way towards the stairs, but loud voices from further on halted their progress. "In here," Beth nipped, through a doorway to a cupboard as they passed earlier. Mops, buckets, rolls of toilet paper, and bottles of cleaning fluid crowded in on Jack as he pushed inside. Beth pulled the door closed, plunging them into a stifling blackness. The only sounds were her quick, shallow breaths and the blood pounding in his ears. Footsteps approached and stopped outside. Jack pressed his ear against the door to listen. A muffled voice came from the other side. "You go downstairs, and I'll search along here. They can't have got far. I've alerted the gate, so they won't be able to escape that way." Jack heard the footsteps moving away. What should they do? If they left the relative safety of the cupboard, they'd definitely be spotted. Maybe it would be better to wait a while until the guards had thought they'd escaped. But after 10 minutes of standing in a cramped, stuffy cupboard, the stank of cleaning fluid, trying not to make a noise, they both had enough. "We'll have to take the risk," he whispered. He pushed the door and peeped through the crack. There was no sign of the men. He stepped out and beckoned for Beth to follow. "Hey!" A sudden shout made them spin around. A security guard stood at the far end of the corridor, blocking their escape route. Panic froze Jack to the spot. The guard had a growling dog on a lead at his side. Jack fled in the opposite direction, Beth beside him. The man's footsteps followed, and the clinking of sharp claws on the floor. Heavy panting pursued them as they pelted along. "Faster!" yelled Jack. He threw a look behind them. The dog's frothing mouth and sharp teeth were gaining on them with every step. Then the passageway split into two. "Which way?" Beth gasped. Jack hesitated, fear numbing his brain. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of an illuminated fire exit sign off to the right. "This way," he shouted, pointing to the sign, and they set off again, at full speed. Jack tugged the door to the fire exit open. A narrow stairway faced him with steps leading up and down. "Somebody's coming." Beth's eyes widened with alarm, the unmistakable thud of pounding feet rising up the stairwell. "We go up," said Jack, praying the door wouldn't be locked at the top. He scrambled upwards, taking 2 steps at a time, not caring how much noise he made and ignoring the searing pain in his leg. He panted painful, gasping breaths, struggling through the narrow windpipe. They reached the last step. Jack shoved the heavy fire door, pushing on the metal bar that ran along its length. It groaned and creaked, but thankfully swung outwards. They tumbled into the warm air. They were at the top of the building, on a flat, asphalted part of the roof. Jack was shocked to see a red glow peeping between the trees. Sunrise loomed. More time must have passed than he'd imagined. But for him, the sunlight was another complication then. He wasn't wearing his cream. His eyes scanned the roof for something with which to barricade the door, until they fell upon an old broom a workman must have left up there. He rushed to the door as the dog slammed against it, pushing it open a crack. Its teeth were pulled back in a snarl, saliva spraying from its cavernous mouth. He rustled the door shut again. The guard called out, but Jack took no notice. He jammed the broom handle through the bar and under the lock. It wouldn't hold for long, but maybe long enough for them to figure out a way off the roof. He hurried to the railings and looked over, hoping for a drain pipe or an escape ladder. No such luck. An iron platform abutted the area and led out onto a steeply sloping glass roof. At the end, 10 meters away, Jack noticed a small window, open about 20 centimeters. Beyond that, he could see the leafy tops of trees, a bank of orangey-pink clouds as the sun crept over the horizon. "We'll have to go over the glass to reach that window." "Jack!" Something in Beth's voice made him reel around. She was holding her side and grimacing. Jack could see her shoulders heaving up and down as she struggled to get the words out. "Why don't we give ourselves up?" He shook his head. "We can do this. It's not far." A banging and pounding from the direction of the door made Jack grab hold of Beth's hand to hurry onto the iron platform. "Is it safe?" He followed her wide-eyed gaze and took the sheer panes of glass that stretched between where they stood and the open window. It was like a huge glass conservatory. Thin steel frames separated the glass panes. From a platform, a ladder led downwards, hugging the panes until it reached the edge of the roof, where a line of glass bricks rose up to form a parapet. No chance for shadow jumping here. Shade was non-existent. "Can it take our weight?" "If we step on the frames next to the parapet, we'll be fine," said Jack with confidence he didn't feel. He glanced towards the window. A beam of sunlight was creeping up the roof towards it. So little time. "Ready?" He looked at her. She shuddered and then gave a tight-lipped smile. "You first." He stepped onto the thin strip of frame, expecting it to creak under his weight, but nothing happened. He placed another foot on the glass parapet. With one foot on there and the other on the narrow frame, he shuffled along. Loud thumps and bangs from behind him made him realize he was moving too slowly. He looked at the parapet running alongside and gingerly stepped onto it. He caught sight of the ground falling away below him. Dizziness overwhelmed him for a second. He had a sudden flashback to slipping from the roof and Beth stretching out her arm to save him. That seemed like a lifetime ago. To his other side, he looked down on a series of open-plan offices. In one, two cleaners worked, wiping desks and emptying bins. He stopped to take a few deep breaths and, looking forward, concentrated on placing one foot in front of the other as if walking on a tightrope. He stretched his arms out to his sides to steady himself and moved across the glass, not daring to look behind to check on Beth. As he progressed, he felt his muscles loosen, the tension dropping from his body. He could do this, he thought, as his movements became more fluid and steady. Although it was early morning, the air had turned muggy already. Beads of sweat started to form on his forehead, trickling down his face. His shirt felt as if it was soldered to his chest. The sun's rays caught pinpricks of pain on his back and the top of his skull. He tried not to think about whether his skin was frying. Jack stopped and scuffled around to face the glass roof, his heels overhanging the parapet. Here, the opaque glass made it impossible to see what was beneath him. He stretched out his arms, leaning forwards, but he couldn't reach the window. He looked behind him. The ground was a long way down. No escape that way. He shifted his gaze back to the window. He needed to concentrate. Now was not the time to freak out. He shook his hands by his sides, puffed out his cheeks, and blew through his mouth. Then he launched himself towards the window, arms stretched in front, fingers splayed. He caught hold of the frame, his body slamming into the glass. Ugh! The breath rushed out of his lungs. The metal dug into the flesh on his fingers. For a moment he hung from the frame, his feet grappling the slippery glass, trying to get enough grip to heave himself up. His top had ridden up, and the early morning sun struck his back. Fierce rays bounced off the roof, hitting his skin and creating pockets of burning pain. How long had he been out there? Seconds? Minutes? He heard a faint popping noise. Was that his skin, blistering on the roof, expanding from the heat? He had to move fast, ignoring the agony from the stretched muscles in his arms. He pulled himself towards the opening, his legs kicking and shoes slipping on the panes. He maneuvered his head through the window and then his arms and shoulders. Easing the rest of his body through the small gap, he dropped onto a table in the empty office below. He sank onto his haunches, arms wrapped around his knees, waiting for his breathing to return to normal and for his legs to stop shaking. A minute later, a thud came from outside the window. The gray, cloudy outline of Beth's body appeared flattened against the glass. Straightening up, he stuck his head through the window. She pushed her rucksack towards him. As he jerked it inside, a creaking and whirring noise started above his right ear. The window's shutting, he shouted. He reached as far as he could and grasped her hand tightly. His torso was half out the window as he balanced his toes to tug her. Her legs and feet thrashed against the glass as she tried to propel herself up and through the gap. Jack felt the frame brush against his back as it attempted to close. With one massive heave, he managed to haul her up the final part. He pulled himself back inside to allow her body to slip through the remaining narrow gap and thump onto the table next to him. This way, he jumped from the table, squeezed between two large polished wooden desks, and vaulted over a swivel chair. He tore towards the door only for it to crash open in front of him. "Watch out, Jack!" His body stiffened as a large figure clothed in black loomed over him. The man seized him before he could dart out of the way, clamping his arm by his sides. Another guard swiftly entered the room and grabbed Beth. Jack twisted this way and that, the air being pressed out of his body by the iron grip. His lungs felt as if they were about to explode as he struggled to breathe. With one final wrench, he managed to twist free of the man's grasp, but his body was off balance, and as he reeled away, he stumbled. The last thing he remembered was the desk rushing up to meet him. Then the darkness fell. Chapter 21. Ugh! Leave me alone! Wake up, Jack! A voice called him, the sound faint and muffled. Jack groaned. He thought he was going to be sick. He opened his eyes a slit. Blurry shapes whirled in front of him. He took his head, trying to clear his visions, then blinked rapidly, his lid scratching over dry eyeballs. His mouth felt as if he'd been chewing on cardboard, and his skull throbbed like it had been split in two with the cleaver. He was lying in a small room on a metal trolley bed, like the kind found in a hospital. With relief, he realized he could move his legs and arms. A single light bulb hanging above him from the center of the ceiling cast a weak, yellowish glow. A kind of metal workbench ran around the sides of the small room, with glass-fronted cabinets hanging above it. A faint smell of disinfectant hung in the air, along with another disgusting stench. Looking down, Jack realized it came from him. A kidney-shaped cardboard sick dish lay next to him on the bed. A foul yellow liquid swimming in the bottom, he moaned. Looking in the bowl made him want to throw up again. "Are you okay?" asked Beth. He sat on the chair beside him, her white face streaked with dirt and tears. Her black makeup had smudged to create two dark panda circles around her eyes. What happened? He heaved himself up into a sitting position. You knocked yourself out on the desk. The guards carried you here. Her voice was etched with weariness and worry. She flopped back in her seat, rubbing her tired eyes. They'll be coming back in a minute with a doctor. I feel weird. Numb, that's what he actually felt. You're bound to, after being knocked out. Panic surged through his body. They'd been caught. Who knew what they would do to them now? He struggled to twist around and place his feet on the ground. How are we going to get out of here? Beth was strangely silent. Jack guessed she was trying to think of some comforting words to help him. But what was there to say? His dad, the great scientist, had experimented on him. He was convinced. He was willing to risk his son's life for the sake of anti-aging drug. Jack had no idea whether it was for money or fame or to save his reputation as a scientist. It didn't matter why. The fact was that he didn't care about his family. A sharp twinge shot up his damaged skin. Dad didn't care about him. And would being given an anti aging drug mean he'd live longer than anyone else, or would he endure more horrible side effects? One thing was certain there was no point living longer if he spent it in Blackstone's clutches. And he owed it to Beth to get her out of this mess he'd created. Blackstone couldn't keep them locked up. For one thing, they would start to be missed. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Auntie Lil, she would be fretting. Perhaps already called the police. He reached in his pocket for his phone, then with a heart as heavy as marble, he remembered the shattered fragments lying on his bedroom floor. He struggled to his feet, his legs almost crumpling underneath him as nausea swept over him. He scuffled to the door and jiggled the handle. I've already checked that, said Beth from her position slumped in the chair. It's locked. They said it was a precaution. They want the doctor to see you. They're only going to be gone a few minutes. She looked exhausted, as if all the fight had left her. Sorry, said Jack as he slid to the floor by the door. What for? Sorry for getting you into this mess. I shouldn't have made you come. Hey, you didn't make me come. I wanted to. None of this is your fault. Beth came over and sat next to him. He buried his head in his hands, and an uncontrolled sob racked his body. Then he realized with a start Beth was talking to him. They've taken it. If they've touched them, I'll... What are you talking about? My rucksack. They've got it. A red cloud settled over Jack, and a huge wave of anger threatened to erupt from inside. Is that all you can worry about? Here we are, stuck in some hole. Nobody has a clue where we are, and all you care about is your stupid rucksack? There's no need to be like that. Beth turned her frightened face toward his. Yeah, there is. Why are you so bothered about those ashes? It's not like they're there anyway. An ominous silence followed these words, and as soon as they left his mouth, he wanted to bite them back. He wished he could crawl into a deep, dark hole and never come out. Sorry, he mumbled, the hot burst of anger cooling as it had gushed out. I shouldn't have said that. What did you mean? Forget it. I didn't mean anything. Beth glared at him, her pale, grimy face drained of color. He squirmed under her gaze. Tell me. He swallowed nervously. The ashes came out of one of the urns yesterday, and Auntie Lil accidentally hoovered them up. That's one sick joke, Jack. It's true. And when were you going to tell me? She looked at him. Oh, I see. Waiting till I'd helped you with your stupid plan, huh? Well, thanks a bunch. I didn't want to upset you. Yeah, right. How do you think I feel now? He flushed. Why had he let anger get the better of him? He wanted to comfort her, put an arm around her, but he didn't think she'd want him anywhere near. Her reaction to his outburst alarmed him. Before this idiotic scheme to investigate the lab, she'd have thumped him for saying something like that. It was still fresh in his mind how she'd reacted to Kai on the roof. Now she looked like a deflated balloon. Her face was pinched and closed. Even worse, a tear had appeared and rolled down her cheek. Listen, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. Not all of the ashes are gone. I managed to sweep most of them up. An oppressive silence followed, which one Jack wanted desperately to break, but he didn't know how. It was his own fault. He'd messed up. I've always blamed myself, she eventually mumbled, wiping her face on her sleeve. Blamed yourself for what? My parents' death. Jack puckered his brow and then grimaced as a dull ache pulsed through his bruised forehead. It was an accident. Beth shook her head. They were going to a party and left me at home with Amma, our neighbor. I was fed up with being left behind, so I got Amma to ring them saying I wasn't feeling well, even though I was fine. They turned around to come home, and the lorry hit them on their way back. I kept thinking if I hadn't persuaded Amma I was ill, my mom and dad would still be alive today. She hugged her knees with her arms. I never talked to anyone about it before, not even Kathy. Despite his guilt and worry, a warm tingle spread through his body. If he was the first person she'd told, maybe she thought of him more than just a friend. It wasn't your fault. It was fate or bad luck or something. Your parents wouldn't want you blaming yourself. You have to let it go. That's the trouble. I don't think I can, she sniffed, and then pulled her shoulders back. Sorry about the tears. I don't usually cry so easily. Eager to do something, anything, Jack wandered around the room, which didn't take long. He fought to keep the anxiety and fear at bay, wrestling with his cotton wool brain to come up with a plan to get them out of this mess. It soon became clear there was no way out apart from through the locked door. The cabinets were all padlocked and held nothing anyway which could help them escape. He sprawled on the bed and peeked at the bandage covering his leg. A brief glimpse of the yellow sticky covering made his stomach flip over. "We need to get out of here," he said, "before they come back." "I think we should wait. Those guards said you need to see a doctor. I don't think they'll do anything to hurt us." "Are you crazy?" Jack looked at her in disbelief. "Are you seriously suggesting we wait to find out what they might do to us? They use children in experiments. Do you want that to happen to you?" Jack's voice had risen to a screech. He couldn't believe Beth wanted to sit and wait for some madman to use them as test subjects. "I don't like to say this, but you're being a tad OTT. We don't know anything, Jack. We shouldn't jump to conclusions without knowing the facts. What proof do we have? All we've got is the word of a dodgy man who sweeps the streets and some articles in a shoddy newspaper. We've got me. I'm the proof. What's with you anyway? You've changed your tune. All that stuff about investigating this place, meeting Blackstone, that was before." "Before what?" "Oh, I don't know, Jack. Before you went all weird and wanted to snoop around in here. Look, if we apologize, they might let us go with a warning. They didn't seem that scary to me." "You've got to be kidding." Jack glared at her. "They're not going to let us go. We know their secret." Beth lowered her smudged eyes and pressed her lips together as if to prevent words from tumbling from her mouth. "A dead dog, rats with the same symptoms as me, secret labs. What more evidence do you need?" "Okay, okay, stop being so stressy." Beth chewed her lip. "I know it looks bad. What do you have in mind, Houdini?" Jack ignored Beth's comment. "I'll wait beside the door and jump on him. You could—" "I could kick him where it hurts," said Beth. "Then we run." "It's not brilliant," Jack sighed, "but it might work." They didn't have long to wait to put the plan into action. At that moment, the keys rattled in the lock. "Quick, get ready," whispered Jack as he stood up and clenched his fist. He moved towards the door and waited. Beth took up position next to him. The heavy, solid door thudded open, and a shadowy figure emerged from the gloom outside.